Be caught as a seminarian was to be carried off and killed or to be put in a concentration camp.
You need all vocations, right, to be a fully functioning church.
Use your experience to pursue your vocation and use the Catholic tradition as the guide.
Welcome back to the Everyday Saint podcast. Today we are here with Dr. Grattan Brown, and we're going to be discussing all things Pope St. John Paul II and vocations, which is definitely a big question mark, I think, on most young people's lives is what am I to do with my vocation? So I'm really excited to have this conversation. So welcome, Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to have this conversation.
Yes, so it seems that Pope St. John Paul II really had a knack for helping people find their vocation or find where God wanted them to go. What was it about him? What was he doing that was helping people so much?
Well, I think I've got an idea. I don't claim to know his secret, but when he thought of vocation, he thought of God drawing a person from the inside. When God calls someone, he draws everything in their inner experience to himself through some service or task or role. There's a lot that goes into a vocation. But the idea is that God is drawing that person, pulls on that person's experience and knowledge and relationships and skills, talents, and their character development in order to lead them one step at a time in a path where he created them to go, where they would best go. And I know some people kind of worry, what if I don't find God's will? And I think God works with us regardless of what we choose. And some people maybe are more attentive, others less attentive. Some people maybe wander for a year or two or a decade or so, and then get a better idea of what God's calling them to. But John Paul II, he was very patient. He knew he was planting seeds when he interacted with young people because he knew that inner experience and that person's personal relationship with God would take time to mature. And he was there to help them along their way as a priest and a representative of the church, and within the church they might find one or another vocation. So I think that was his approach. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about his own vocation, how that developed.
Yes, definitely. I'd love to hear that, especially because we've kind of hinted at the fact that he didn't always think that he was going to be a priest, and he had such a love for theater and the arts and things that correlated very well to his priesthood, but maybe he didn't always anticipate. So I'd love a little bit of insight on how he actually ended up becoming a priest.
Yeah, he did think about making an entire career, better put, vocation, as an actor and a playwright. Even before that, his father really formed his vocation. His father was a virtuous man, a military officer, but through and through a Christian, spent lots of time in prayer. His son noticed that. Mm-hmm. His father took care of Karol Wojtyła after his mother died and then after his brother died, moving with him to Krakow when John Paul II went off to college at the Jagiellonian University. And John Paul II saw in his father a layman who was becoming holy, seeing very clearly that vocation to holiness that we all share by both our creation and especially our baptism is something that lay people are called to just as much as priests and nuns and monks. Mm-hmm. Then, as you mentioned, when he went through his teenage years, he really got into the theater. And the theater was a real meaningful commitment. It wasn't a hobby, especially as World War II started and the Nazis intended to eliminate the Polish identity and culture. John Paul II, then known as Karol Wojtyła, and his friends in the theater saw themselves as preserving Polish culture and identity over against the Nazi occupation and their effort to stamp it out. John Paul II wrote plays. They were often wove together biblical themes and Polish culture. So one play he called Job, after the biblical book, tried to make sense of the suffering of the Polish people under the Nazi occupation. Another one, Jeremiah, was the name of the play, as well as the biblical book, trying to make sense of why is this happening to us as a people? Kind of like Jeremiah asked, well, why is this happening to us as the ancient Hebrews? He translated Sophocles from the ancient Greek into Polish. So he and the theater troupe in which he participated, called the Rhapsodic Theater, could perform. And that Rhapsodic Theater was completely underground, because if the Nazis had found out what they were doing, they would have carted them off to prison, or worse, they would have shot them. There were over 100 practices, play rehearsals, all underground, sometimes in the basement apartment where the Wojtyłas lived. Mm-hmm. And they put on upwards of 7 or 10 productions, over 20, 30 performances. And there's one famous one where Karol Wojtyła is playing the lead role in a Polish epic. And the war sirens start to go off, and blaring over the loudspeaker is a Nazi announcement that the Nazis are winning the war, that the army was advancing, and the noise level went up and up and up, so that the people gathered for the performance just about couldn't hear the actors. And Karol Wojtyła just delivered his lines more and more loudly, so that he could be heard over the cacophony around them. I always took that as sort of emblematic, that John Paul II, as Pope, and earlier Karol Wojtyła as Bishop and Archbishop, was going to raise his voice, the voice of the Church, over and above the regimes that he encountered, first the Nazi regime and then the communist one. So that felt call to a theater vocation was not only something meaningful, far surpassing any kind of hobby that people sometimes think of it as today, but it was a life and death move, because he and his theater troupe could have been killed for what they were doing. But that was not his call. Mm-hmm. It was something else. That theater, sort of as you alluded to a little while ago, though, what he learned there prepared him to, in a sense, perform on the world stage, to be able to be in front of millions of people and have them feel like he was speaking directly to them. Because in a way he was, because the Holy Spirit was involved when he would preach a homily and spread the gospel to all of those many, many people. But so he felt that shift right about 1941. And the immediate sad event that happened was his father died. Remember, his father and he were living together in a basement apartment owned by his deceased mother's family in Krakow. And he came home from work one day and his father had died. He was terribly distraught. But this sparked in him a kind of maturity, a kind of, okay, well, what does this mean for my life? Where am I going next? And I think he himself said he felt that call maybe from an early age. He felt it building in him. He was focused on the theater, but that feeling grew. And over an 18-month period or so, right around 1941, he started to come into contact more and more with the leadership of the church in Poland, notably Cardinal Adam Sapieha. And Cardinal Sapieha spotted Wojtyła's talent, even mentioned to another priest, tell me about this Wojtyła. Oh, he wants to go and be an actor. And Sapieha's comment was, well, that's a pity,
Hmm.
because he saw something in Wojtyła. And then Wojtyła began to see it in himself. And for about an 18-month period of really intense prayer, came to the conclusion that God was calling him to be a priest. And that and his reasoning was, if God was calling me to be a priest, then that is what I must do. And that thus ended the discernment. He went into the seminary, which was underground seminary, because to be a seminarian, to be caught as a seminarian was to be carried off and killed, or to be put in a concentration camp. A fate which did happen to some of the seminarians that entered the seminary at the same time as Wojtyła did. And Wojtyła felt that though he felt as if he was preserved in a certain way, whereas they were lost. And that sense of being, his life was preserved, he felt like, for a reason and for a mission. And that certainly gave him motivation to continue when times got tough, which they did very much. So there's a kind of a sketch
Mm-hmm.
of how John Paul II, moved through childhood, thought of himself as a playwright and an actor with a very meaningful vocation, and then said, no, that's not it,
Mm-hmm.
and turned toward the priesthood.
Yes. Did he ever write or talk about that time of discernment for him when he was thinking about the priesthood? Just like, I'm just curious if we know what was going through his mind as he was considering this, especially knowing how dangerous it would have been for him to join the seminary. Do we know what he was thinking?
Well, he wrote about it, and I would really refer people simply to his own writings. He wrote a book pretty late in his pontificate, Gift and Mystery, in which he reflected back on his priesthood over 50 years, because this book was for the 50th anniversary of his priesthood. And then he wrote about it as gift and mystery all through his writings. There's also a series of letters he wrote to priests every Holy Thursday, so that you can get an idea of, the sort of, he thought about it over time as a gift of self, a very common concept that John Paul II returns to again and again and again. In the theology of the body, you also even find it in the documents of Vatican II. So not just his concept, but those of others as well. And, it's the idea that your life is a gift. You realize it as a gift over time, because it takes a while to actually realize, the depth of the gift that it is, and then offers it. I think we talked in an earlier podcast about how he got hit by a truck in the World War II and knocked to the side of the road, left in a ditch for dead, but he survived. And that event shaped his way of thinking about his vocation. Again, God has preserved my life for some reason, and I think it's to be a priest, and I'm going to set out on that road. Once he did, he surely got confirmations on the way that he was on the right path. So I think along the way in his mind, there was a sort of, I've got to this step. I know this is the way. I'm going to commit to it. And then what comes next? And God is leading me here, preserving my life. My life is in God's hands, ultimately. And so I'm going to be brave and take the prudent risks and do what I think God is calling me to do in the moment, and not so much worry about, when and how my life's going to end.
Right.
I think that gives some insight as to what he started thinking even early on.
Definitely. And I think probably too that confidence that he had and the risk that it was to join the seminary, especially after he had all these goals and dreams and
Mhm.
just even this perspective on his life and how much of a gift it is,
Mm.
probably really helped him to walk other people through their vocation and why he was so passionate about it throughout his entire life of writing theology of the body. And theology of the body too applies to people of all ages, of all vocations, whether you're married or not, or preparing for marriage, like there's so much there that it's all warranted towards the vocation, and he just had such a great perspective on it. Do you think this idea of the gift of self was that kind of his general advice maybe for
Mhm.
walking young people through their vocation? Because that was also something that he was known for, right? Was bringing these people to on hikes and out on adventures and
Mhm.
pilgrimages in order to give them advice. And so much of what
Mhm.
young people are thinking about is, what is my vocation? What does God want me to do? So is that gift of self really relevant, you think, to these conversations he was having?
Yes, and that concept solidified in his mind as he was having those conversations. He would listen, hear what their questions, their perplexities were, and ask, what is it in the gospel that really speaks to these people? The idea of self gift is that God has given you certain things that are properly your own and that no one should take away from you.
Hmm.
So, your very life, your body, your conscience, your judgment, your aspirations, um, your family, your intimate relationships, your spouse. There are certain things that each person possesses, all their own, that others should not take away from them. So there's gift,
Mhm.
and your gift is yours. And at the same time, all that you're given is the basis for your service to others. And that's also the gift of self, right? So you have a self to give,
Mhm.
and you give it. So a man and a woman give themselves to each other in marriage. They're giving their whole life, body and soul, to each other. And together they're going to bring forth children if God gives them children. And then they're going to give themselves to parenting. And that's going to involve a lot of thought and prayer and forming of judgments about how to raise this child and then how to raise that child because they're different.
Mhm.
And they're forming their conscience every day about how to proceed and build up their household and how to remain faithful to each other and how to make decisions together. A, um, a religious male or female is giving their life to God. They are thinking in terms of not only the basic Christian acts of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, but wrapped into the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And they are living a very intimate following of Christ through their whole life, bringing whatever talents they have, whatever experiences they have that led them, before they entered a monastery or convent. And I think as we were talking a little bit before the video started rolling, every priest or nun or monk, they've got some experiences before they found their vocation.
Mhm.
And oftentimes that's a great preparation for the role they're going to take in their community. So, the idea is that this gift of self, there's certain things that you possess, all your own. And all of those things can be the basis for what you have to give for other people. And that concept, you can see just how much you can really do with that concept. That any priest could listen to somebody and say, well, get to know them as a person
Mhm.
and say, oh, I see all these talent. I see these relationships. I see this hard lesson you learned. I see this opportunity you have. Here's maybe what you could consider. What do you think? And then, you have to decide because you're going to live with that choice. And John Paul II was famous for giving people counsel and then saying, now, you must decide.
Right. It's all up to them ultimately. And
Yeah,
and their prayer too, right? Like he can't tell them what to do because he's not God.
right,
Which is
right.
very wise on his end
Oh,
to
absolutely.
just take that step back and understand this is the advice I'm giving you, but I'm not going to tell you what to do, as much as even sometimes our own egos want to tell someone what to
Yeah,
do and say, oh, I'm the wise person here.
yeah.
Let me tell you what to do. But he didn't do that. And I know we've talked a little bit more about marriage, but I'd love to know maybe what some of his advice would be for either, religious sisters or for the priesthood in discerning that.
Oh, for that kind of discernment, I think that um, different people are different. I think some people sort of know intuitively, I'm a priest, I'm a nun. The current Pope Leo XIV, when you heard his family members interviewed on
Oh,
the
that was
TV,
great. Wasn't that like
wasn't
the
it?
best to see? I loved it.
There's some great stories in there, but
Mhm.
one of them is not only, well, he loved to play priest, but also he had a natural affinity for religion. He took to it. He was prayerful, even from a young age. And I think John Paul II was similar. Even though he thought of a vocation to the theater, he also had a certain affinity for religion from a very young age and a very prayerfulness from a very young age. Other people, I think, take longer to come to a kind of decision. Another sort of piece of advice that I picked up along the way, it's not my advice, people told to me, is discern one thing at a time. Priesthood, yes or no. Marriage with this person, yes or no. Religious vocation to the Franciscans or the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy, yes or no. So you're not trying to decide between, this congregation or that congregation or priesthood or marriage or anything like that. Just focus on one thing at a time and learn what you have to learn from that, and then come to a decision point and then move on.
Right. Yeah, I like that perspective that it's one step at a time. That
Hmm.
that makes it a little bit less overwhelming, and I can imagine that, he would walk with these people,
Yeah.
literally, like walk with them, and just to have these conversations
Hmm.
about where God wants them to go. Why do you think this idea of a vocation was so foundational to his ministry?
Hmm. Well, because he knew that the church needs vocations, but more than that, God calls people for something meaningful. God created each one of us for a purpose. And, we're restless until we find that purpose. And even after we find that purpose, there's still some restlessness, but it's different, I think. Once you sort of settle on a vocation, once you sort of find, here's what I think I'm made for, and I'm going to go for it. There is a kind of peace. John Paul II was often described as a happy warrior.
Hmm.
In many senses, one, he suffered mightily opposing the Polish communist government and leading the church under its oppression. But also his personal suffering, his illness, his sense of loss of his family. But he remained a kind of cheerfulness. Similarly, when people are discerning a vocation, yeah, sometimes it's ambiguous, sometimes you're confused, sometimes you're, afraid, other times maybe you're joyful, but there's a kind of cheerfulness that can move through all of that. You know? Um, and so, I think if somebody's in the midst of discerning their vocation, try to approach it as a happy warrior.
Hmm.
Let's focus on it sometimes, pray sometimes, pray about that, but pray about other things, pray about the other things in your life. Go out and serve people, live a Christian life. And, without focusing all the time on the vocation. And your experiences then God will kind of lead you and things will become clear over time. JP2 knew that, God creates each one of us for a purpose. And he was going to be there to help people find that. So I think he spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean for Christ to say to the apostles, follow me. And when he participated in the Second Vatican Council, which in Lumen Gentium, chapter 6 or so, speaks about the universal call to holiness. We're all called to become holy through our baptism by following Christ. And each one of us has a kind of vocation within that larger vocation to become holy. Maybe it's to the priesthood, maybe it's to celibate consecrated life, maybe for most of us, it's to family life in one way or another. And, he had a nice way, or he had a distinctive way, I would say, of articulating those different vocations. He was thoroughly grounded in the Catholic tradition, which is the best guide for life that anybody could take. But, he's not listening to JP2 was not listening to the catechism. It wasn't even like just reading the Bible. It was Christ said, follow me. And here's some insight into what that means today. And let's talk about our experience of following Christ together so that we can help each other discern what is Christ calling us to in this moment. So one thing I thought we could do is just read a few snippets from the way that John Paul II describes the vocation of family, the vocation of priesthood. There are a few other ones. I snatched out a few quotes, put them down on a piece of paper that I gave to you. I thought we could read them.
I think that's great. Actually, that was going to be one of my next questions anyways, was just kind of his general oversight on or opinions, I guess, on each type of vocation and kind of maybe what we should be looking for in each of those.
I think these quotes give us his distinctive voice, the kind of flavor of his thought, how he gave a particular depth of insight through his experience and his pastoral efforts, a kind of a spin, in the best sense of the word, on what those vocations are. So I'll read it. You can think about it. We'll talk about it a little bit.
Okay,
all right?
Sounds good.
So here's what he has to say about the vocation of the family. This is from his letter to families from 1994. And he writes, a person normally comes into the world within a family. When he has no family, the person develops an anguished sense of pain and loss, one which will subsequently burden his whole life. The church draws near with loving concern to all who experience situations such as these, for she knows well the fundamental role which the family is called to play. Furthermore, she knows that a person goes forth from the family in order to realize a new family unit in his particular vocation in life. Even if someone chooses to remain single, the family continues to be, as it were, his existential horizon, that fundamental community in which the whole network of social relations is grounded, from the closest and most immediate to the most distant.
Wow. I think maybe if we just pause and talk about each one a little bit too before we go into the next one, because it's a lot of information. Well, I think the first thing that I kind of notice is just the continuity of the family life.
Yeah.
How it, one can have more than one family even, and yet each family is the foundation of the entire society, and just like this interconnectedness within the family life. Like, I could go on to be married one day, but I still have my parents. I still have my siblings. Those don't go away just because I've started a new family. And I find that actually quite interesting within the family vocation in particular, that you're using this foundation that you had while still keeping in touch with it and keeping at your roots, but starting anew in a way that is completely and totally different than the experience that you had. I think sometimes the family life is viewed as the most natural vocation because it's something that we've all experienced. Yet, when you actually encounter that family life as a parent or as a spouse, it's a completely different role than
Yeah.
what you were experiencing as a child
Yeah.
of parents.
Yeah. And even if you didn't get married,
Mhm.
the family that you have is still what he says, the whole network of social relationships is grounded
Mhm.
in that. And that struck me because earlier he says, when a person has no family, there's an anguished sense of pain and loss. And later on, he almost seems to say, but wait, nobody has no family, because there's still that social network in which you can exist.
Mhm.
And also in that social network is the church, who understands humanity, understands the family, and brings together families, uniting them in the faith. So in a way, so what would be let's say, how would we articulate the let's say the vocation of the family? We might say it's the warp and weave of society. We might say it's the place where loneliness is overcome.
Hmm.
Remember, a
Mhm.
man and wife come together so that they are no longer lonely. Um, but also, each person goes forth from the family to realize a new family unit in his particular vocation. I think John Paul II is also saying, well, monasteries are like families,
Hmm.
and communities of religious sisters, they're like families too. And some people leave their family of origin in order to participate in those other families. So there's a kind of sort of vocation of growing up, providing a place for people to grow up and find their vocations. And that becomes a vocation for the family, as well as, the things we all know from catechism. It's a community of life and love, open to children, fidelity among the spouses, a lifelong commitment, contributing to each other's holiness. Yeah, all that is part of the mission and vocation of the family. But here's John Paul giving us a little bit of his own insight.
Right, which I really appreciate hearing and being reminded of a lot of these things when it comes to the family life because again, it just seems like the most natural vocation. It's not like you think of discerning and it seems like a discerning must mean priesthood or being a religious sister. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also a lot of discerning of finding out am I someone who's meant to be married,
Yeah,
right? And then you find, eventually you'll find the right person if that is
yeah.
your vocation. But then I think there should be discernment before you even start finding out who the right person is of
Mm-hmm.
what is it exactly about the family life that intrigues me as vocation.
Mm-hmm.
Why to me in particular does this seem like God's path to holiness for
Mm-hmm.
me? I mean, that's the real question because we don't want to dismiss our own holiness just because or the holiness that the family can involve, but just
Mm-hmm.
because it seems like the most societally normal vocation.
Mm-hmm. And when people sort of, let's say, get married and found a new family, they come at it with certain goals. Like,
Hmm.
my family of origin was really good at this, not so good at that. And therefore, my family, I want to really focus on this and be really good at this. And, because, of my own family experience, I've developed a certain perspective. And that then becomes something I have to give to my kids.
Hmm.
Be it maybe I'll be a really good teacher for them, or I'll be a really good provider, or I can teach them. I'm a really good scientist, and I can show them, the wonders in the natural world through science. I think each person cultivates, even before they're married, certain hopes for what their family might be like, and then starts preparing for that
Hmm.
even before they're married. And then maybe that colors positively and helpfully what they're looking for in a spouse.
Right,
Mhm.
definitely. I think we should maybe
Yeah.
cover the next vocation. So, celibacy of consecrated life.
Celibacy of consecrated life. Now, remember, a consecrated person is following the evangelical counsels, which is poverty, chastity, and obedience. And these are sort of founded on the three basic Christian acts of prayer, fasting, and
Almsgiving.
almsgiving. Thank you.
Hmm.
So what John Paul II writes in Vita Consecrata on the consecrated life in 1996, but those who are called to the consecrated life have a special experience of the light, which shines forth from the incarnate word. For the profession of evangelical counsels makes them a kind of sign and prophetic statement for the church and for the world. Consequently, they can echo in a particular way the ecstatic words spoken by Peter, Lord, it is well that we are here.
Mm. Interesting. I think this is one of the vocations that's most misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
is the idea of consecrated life. Would you, kind of in your own words, maybe describe what this is as a vocation for someone who maybe hasn't encountered someone who's devoted to or has consecrated themselves?
Mm-hmm. It can take various forms. A consecrated person is a lay person who takes special vows. They could be privately, just to a spiritual director. They could be to the bishop. Those vows tend to be more binding. And it's a private call by God. Now, what John Paul II here, when he says about consecrated lay people, he also equally applies to all the religious vocations, anyone who follows the evangelical counsels. What he says here is general enough to apply to those as well. So, do you happen to remember where Peter says, in what story Peter says, Lord, it is well that we are here?
I don't
It's
remember.
it's the story of the transfiguration.
Mm,
Where,
yes. Okay. Yep.
yeah,
Hmm.
Peter, James, and John up on the mountain, Jesus is transfigured before them. It is this beautiful sight. And Peter says, it is well that we are here. Let me build some huts. We'll stay.
Hmm.
And Jesus says, yes, it is well that we're here, but it's well that we go back down the mountain too, because we have some work to do and it's going to cause some suffering. But it's that light from Christ that is cultivated by the life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, founded upon the practice of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting, that sort of powers a life given completely to God in the context usually of a community. You have hermits, who start in a community and eventually live in solitude with God, but most in a community. And John Paul II says they have a certain light that serves as an echo. An echo, it is good that we are here. Now, people don't profess a religious vocation in order to have more time for social work or more time for teaching or more time for medical practice or more time for pastoral activities. They do it to have a closer relationship with God, to be in the presence of God in a very deep way, even in this earthly journey. And I think that's what John Paul II is calling out when he says the consecrated life is an echo of the words, Lord, it is well that we are here. Now think of, the presence of religious sisters, right? We can see in the shrine here that people light up when they see the sisters. They're very approachable. They like to go up and talk to them, right? Especially if they want to have a conversation. Maybe there's something that's bothering them. And the sisters of Our Lady of Mercy here quite often have spiritual conversations. Similarly, our chaplain, Father Bill, will have spiritual conversations with people, and all priests live a celibate life. There's a kind of peace and comfort that the life according to the evangelical counsels can communicate to others who don't live that life, who don't have that particular call to consecration. no matter what's happening in this world, it's good that we are here. God put us here, and God gave us the gospel to show us how to live. And we're living that close following of Christ, even to the point of his celibacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what John Paul II is getting at here, using scripture as he does, in his own way of thinking about these things.
I think that's really important to remember, and remember too that people don't choose this life just because they want more time for something else. Something I've always been a little bit confused maybe by this vocation in particular, like a vocation to the consecrated single life,
Uh-huh.
and in particular, just because it's kind of like, well, then why wouldn't you just be a religious sister? Or why wouldn't you just be a priest or a monk or something like
Yeah.
that? But this is an interesting perspective.
Well, I
I
do
think.
think that it's the consecrated life in a certain way is connected to the human vocation to work,
Hmm.
because they are in a way, as St. Paul says, more available
Mm-hmm.
for the works of the Lord. Sometimes that's lived out through being a doctor, through being a lawyer, through being a tradesman. If one finds oneself a single person, maybe one has dreamed and thought all along that one would be married and they never found the right person. And maybe that's a sign that God is quite content for them to remain single and will do great things in their soul and in their work through their consecration to him, through their close following him as a single person. And when John Paul II talks about work, he talks not only about what we produce, but what our work produces in us. The kind of character, the skills and knowledge that we develop that we can then use for other people. The way that taking responsibility in the workplace develops character
Mm-hmm.
is a participation with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and all the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And all of those habits of grace are also what are cultivated, in a particularly beautiful way in all of those who choose to remain single, be they in a consecrated life, out in the world as a layperson, in your apartment, going to mass every day, staying in the office, and then showing up for work, or living in a community like, the Jesuits, pray in common, have their charism founded by St. Ignatius, and then are obedient to the superior in their community, and their community has a certain apostolate along with their prayer life and each one's union with God. So it all kind of works together.
It does. We need all vocations,
Mm-hmm.
right, to be a fully functioning church.
Mm-hmm. We do. And John Paul II had this beautiful way of connecting them all through the inner dynamic or the subjectivity of the human person. You want to take one more?
Sure, let's do it.
Let's see. We have, this is an interesting one. John Paul II saw an entire people as having a kind of vocation. And he's thinking about the Polish people, because their very identity is, and consequently their mission and their vocation in history is threatened. And in 1978, he participated in the conclave that elected John Paul I,
Right.
who was Pope only about 25 days or so before he died. And I think it was during the conclave that elected John Paul I that John Paul II penned a poem entitled Stanislav, after Saint Stanislav, a Polish bishop in the Middle Ages, about 100 years after Poland converted to Christianity. And Bishop Stanislav was martyred by the Polish king at the time, Boleslaw, because Stanislaus basically criticized the king's immoral practices and kept doing so. And so finally the king had enough and had him put to death, and had to do it himself because the other soldiers wouldn't do it for him. And John Paul II looked at Stanislaus as, a representative of the church who stood up against the secular authority and preached the gospel and witnessed to the gospel on behalf of his people, leading his people in their vocation as a Christian people to witness as a people. And so you can probably see the connection here. John Paul II, the Archbishop of Krakow and a cardinal at that time, and cardinals have broader responsibility for the church as a whole, as well as their own archdiocese. And then he saw himself as the kind of defender of the city of Krakow, the spiritual defender of the city of Krakow and of the Polish people. So he pens this poem to St. Stanislaus, but also thinking of himself in the position of St. Stanislaus and the Polish people behind him. And here's just an excerpt of this poem. And he's talking about Stanislaus. He writes, "He stood before the king, not with sword, but with word, not to conquer, but to testify. He did not die alone. The church stood with him, not as a shield, but as a witness."
I like that last line in particular, that the church stood with him, not as a shield, but as a witness. I think sometimes we do have that tendency to just look to the church just for that like shield mentality, like,
Yeah.
oh, like I'm safe here,
Yeah.
I'm in my bubble. But really, the church is meant to be a witness and a glorification of what God has done in our life.
Yes. Yes. And all of them together. People go through periods when they need the protection of the church. They're learning, they're growing, they're becoming stronger. They're understanding the tradition. I know in my own life, I was in seminary for a while. I studied deeply the Catholic tradition, and I wanted to focus on that at the time. I mean, I knew the ideas that were floating around in mainstream secular culture because I'd grown up in that. But then at other times, you start going out, being a witness, in a sense, before the kings of the world, to draw upon John Paul II's language in this poem. And the community then always has people who are more focused perhaps on the interior of the church, preserving the tradition. Other people who are maybe even focused on interface with society. So you have, people who are in colleges and universities teaching the tradition, maybe homeschooling their kids, really working on preserving the Catholic tradition. You have other people who are really interfacing with, the work of business ethics and hospital ethics, or practicing law or medicine, doing business in the society and trying to figure out, how do you remain competitive and ethical and doing business in a way that that develops the strong character of yourself and your employees. There's an idea of how people can witness. The people of the church together can be a kind of witness as a people.
Right. We kind of have to be everywhere to really live out the gospel. Like Jesus wouldn't have only gone to the places that he was welcome. In fact, he very much did not do that. He went to the places that if he were any normal person, it would have been difficult to live out his faith in such boldness.
Yeah.
And I think we even see that with the apostles, where they struggled with that a little bit at times. And even Peter, when he denied Jesus 3 times, it's not easy, but we need to be in the places where people don't know the name of Jesus Christ, so that we can be a witness to it and take the time to build our knowledge and our experience and take shelter within the church, because it is a shelter for us at times when we need it to be, but it's also a place to become recharged so we can go out and continue that mission.
Yeah, that's true. I've always been intrigued about how Jesus sometimes took big risks and then sometimes quite prudently and cleverly escaped, right?
Mhm.
There's that line in the gospel where he escaped through the crowds. They were going to toss him off a cliff. And then he taught his apostles, whoever's not against us is for us. Just because some people are healing in my name and they're not sort of part of our dinner table doesn't mean that they're not living the gospel. And then finally, Jesus got, he found opposition from within. Some Jews were his enemies, not all Jews. Some Jews followed him and became his apostles and became his disciples. But there was that tension that even within the church, kind of like John Paul II found in his own pontificate, where sometimes he was opposed in what he wanted to do. And that then became a kind of discernment for him about, well, which way is God leading us?
Yes. Well, this just about brings us to our time today. Were there any other points that you wanted to bring up about Pope St. John Paul II and Vocations before we go, or maybe just a parting piece of advice based on his work?
Yeah. I had a few thoughts to share. I mean, the first thing is commit to following Christ. And if you're willing to make following Christ the first among all of your aspirations, you'll probably find the particular aspirations that can turn into a vocation. In other words, when we're teenagers, we aspire to various things. Like John Paul II aspired to be an actor. And that turned out not to be his way of following Christ. His way of following Christ turned out to be the priesthood, because he was willing to put following Christ before all of the other aspirations. God gave us those desires, those aspirations, allowed them to well up within us for a good reason, because we had something to learn. And, when people are going through high school, their aspirations range from, I want to look great at the beach to I want to study, marine biology in order to, take care of dolphins and everything in between. Often you hear, I want to start a business and make a lot of money. Not a bad thing in itself, but hey, what are you going to do with all that money once you make it? And what are you going to have to sacrifice along the way? And all those things are unknown to someone who's a teenager, and they don't have quite an idea. But as they keep going, if they're willing to allow following Christ to take precedence over whatever set of aspirations they have at the moment, they'll probably find their vocation. In the end, they'll be happy. And another piece of advice would be use your experience, even the painful ones, because there's some meaning in there. And God will use everything that you're going through, the painful things as well as the joys, in order to lead you somewhere. So that's your thoughts, your feelings, the knowledge you have, the relationships that are going well, the relationships that are not going well, the good moments and the bad moments are all used. And, we talked before in a podcast about John Paul II's Carmelite prayer life. Very meditative, even contemplative, where you have your thoughts, you have your feelings of that day, but you take time to sit down and you have those and you present them before God, and eventually you're in the presence of God. You might not feel the presence of God, but all of those thoughts and emotions that seem so heavy get a little bit lighter, and you can see them again with a little bit of perspective. So use your experience to pursue your vocation, and use the Catholic tradition as the guide. John Paul II was a master of it, and he had a great mind for modern culture and philosophy as well. I would give this advice to people, even if I weren't the director of mission and ministry at the St. John Paul II National Shrine, but look into John Paul II's teaching and his writings and his example. There are plenty of biographies out there. I'd start with the ones by George Weigel, and then some of his homilies, and you could go through his World Youth Day
Mhm.
addresses. Would be a great place to start. So I'll leave you with that advice.
Yes, absolutely. This has been really wonderful to hear all about him and his journey, and then also just kind of some different options for us as we move forward and really considering where God wants us to go. So, thank you so much for sharing today.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for the conversation.